So let's just be honest. I had 3 people in my life who I wasn't gonna forgive. Just wasn't gonna happen. And then God says, you know what? You need to raise your forgiveness game. So this story goes back a number of years, and when I reflect on that time in my life, I mean, I was pretty clear with myself that while I was no angel of the third heaven kind of guy, I thought, well, in balance, when the scales of justice weighed up, I'd probably, even if just barely, make it into the good side, right? I'd make it into that good place, right? So self-improvement really wasn't on my radar because, hey, I felt like I was already there. I was already in, so that was good enough. Well, you see, the thing is, my wife was a different kind of person. She's a lot more of the perfectionist mold than I was, and she'd always been kind of pushing, hey, can we do this marriage enrichment course? Can we do this? Can we do that? And I just really wasn't into any of it. Well, you can only say no so many times before eventually you just gotta give in and give her something. You can't always be the no person. So she'd brought forward this course on forgiveness. It was like you meet once a week for 6-7 weeks and you try to be better at forgiveness. I thought, all right, that's fine. How hard can this be? I'm reasonably good at forgiving already, so sure, I'll do this one. Well, when we signed up, I didn't realize it at the time, but a friend of mine him and his wife had signed up as well. And he says to me, oh, so what do you think? How's this going to go? I said, man, don't worry about it. This is going to be easy. I don't find forgiving to be that difficult in the first place. So anyway, we go ahead. After the first week, after the first meeting, he comes back to me and he says, well, now what do you think? I was like, what are you talking about? That's fine, no problem. Piece of cake. And he says, what do you mean? That guy said you got to forgive everybody all the time. And I was like, yeah, I heard that too, but let me tell you, buddy, that ain't gonna happen. I got these few people here that I am just not gonna forgive. And I'm okay. I'll everybody else is all right, but no, these ones ain't gonna happen. No matter what he says, it's just not gonna happen. My friend's rather amused at my cavalier attitudes towards the non-forgiveness. And he says, well, what did these people do to you that you're not going to forgive them? And I said, well, I don't want to get into all the gory details, but essentially, one basically betrayed me. He was a friend, but he wasn't. I had this one family member who let's just say he was self-centered, abusive, and all this stuff. He just didn't deserve forgiveness. And then there was this third person who, well, in a business dealings, they had a choice between choosing the higher performing person, me, or they could have chosen the person who they had connections with their family. And guess what? They choose the family connection, even though I was doing a better job. So those 3, I was like, you know what? You guys all did me wrong, and I have no time for you. Well, this friend of mine, he's better versed in the Bible than I was at the time, and he says, well, aren't you familiar with the Joseph story? He's like, you're a Christian. Joseph was sold to slavery by his family, and well, his employer took the wife's word over him and threw him in prison. And when he goes into prison, his mate forgot him. He says it's basically the same kind of things that happened to you: family member, bad business dealing, and betrayal. Joseph forgave. And I was like, you know what? Joseph's a better person than I am. I'm not trying to be that good. I'm good enough as it is. Thank you very much. These 3 people, they're staying right there in the unforgiveness box. Thank you very much. Well, a few days later, my friend and I meet up for coffee. And he gives me this book. It's called Return from Tomorrow. You can get this on Amazon. It's, probably $5 as cheap as can be because it's been around for a long time. And it's a story about a guy who's an Army medic. He had a near-death experience, kind of changed how he saw the world and everything. And at the end of the book, he tells a story about how he went into a concentration camp in 1945, like as in a medic liberating a concentration camp. So my friend says, look, read this story. It's just a few pages. Read these few pages, and this will transform completely how you see forgiveness. It's like, all right, I got a few minutes, so I'll read it. And you know what? The guy was right. He was absolutely right. And telling you this story, this is really the whole point of this video, because I'm going to read this to you now, because I think it might just change you like it did me. He writes, when the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the 123rd EVAC, the medical team that he was part of, entered Germany with occupying troops. I was part of a group assigned to a concentration camp near Wuppertal, charged with getting medical help to the newly liberated prisoners, many of them Jews from Holland, France, and Eastern Europe. This was the most shattering experience I had yet had. I had been exposed many times by then to sudden death and injury, but to see the effects of slow starvation, to walk through those barracks where thousands of men had died a little bit at a time over a period of years, was a new kind of horror. For many, it was an irreversible process. We lost scores each day in spite of all the medicine and food we could rush to them. Now I needed my new insight indeed. When the ugliness became too great to handle, I did what I had learned to do. I went from one end to the other of that barbed wire enclosure, looking into men's faces until I saw, staring back at me, the face of Christ. And that's how I came to know Wild Bill Cody. That wasn't his real name. His real name was 7 unpronounceable syllables in Polish, but he had a long, drooping handlebar mustache like the picture of old Western heroes, so the American soldiers called him Wild Bill. He was one of the inmates at the concentration camp, but obviously he hadn't been there long. His posture was erect, his eyes bright, his energy indefatigable. He was fluent in English, French, German, and Russian, as well as Polish. He became kind of an unofficial camp translator. We came to him with all sorts of problems. The paperwork alone was staggering in attempting to relocate people whose families, even whole hometowns, might have disappeared. But though Wild Bill worked 15 and 16 hours a day, he showed no signs of weariness. While the rest of us were drooping with fatigue, he seemed to gain strength. "We have time for this old fellow," he'd say. "He's been waiting to see us all day." His compassion for his fellow prisoners glowed on his face, and it was to this glow that I came when my own spirits were low. So I was astonished to learn when Wild Bill's own papers came before us one day that he had been in Wuppertal since 1939. For 6 years he'd lived on that same starvation diet, slept in that same airless and disease-ridden barracks as everyone else, but without the least physical or mental deterioration. Perhaps even more amazing, every group in the camp looked on him as a friend. He was the one whom quarrels between inmates were brought for arbitration. Only after I'd been at Wuppertal a number of weeks did I realize what a rarity this was in a compound where the different nationalities of prisoners hated each other as much as they did the Germans. As for the Germans, the feeling against them ran so high that in some of the camps liberated earlier, former prisoners had seized guns, run into the nearest village, and simply shot the first Germans they saw. Part of our instructions were to prevent this kind of thing again and again, and Wild Bill was once again our greatest asset. Reasoning with the different groups, counseling forgiveness. "It's not easy for some of them to forgive," I commented to him one day as we sat over mugs of tea in the processing center. "So many of them have lost members of their family." Wild Bill leaned back in his chair and sipped at his drink. "We lived in the Jewish section of Warsaw. My wife, our 2 daughters, and our 3 boys. When the Germans reached our street, they lined everyone against a wall and opened up with machine guns. I begged to be allowed to die with my family, but because I spoke German, they put me in a work group." He paused, perhaps seeing again his wife and 5 children. I had to decide right then whether to let myself hate the soldiers who had done this. It was an easy decision, really. I was a lawyer. In my practice, I had seen too often what hate could do to people's minds and bodies. Hate just killed the 6 people who mattered the most to me in the world. I decided then that I would spend the rest of my life, whether it was a few days or many years, loving every person I came in contact with. Loving every person. That was That's what helped him stay mentally sane. That's what kept him physically healthy despite being deprived of everything in a concentration camp. My friend was right. That story did change, transform how I saw forgiveness completely. Because so often I think we go through life thinking that if we forgive somebody, we're letting them off the hook, that we lose, we get the bad deal because they got away with something. But the reason why Jesus tells us to love our enemies, and he told his disciples not to forgive 7 times, but 70 times 7 times, wasn't because he wanted us to get a bad deal. He's telling us this because he wants us to get a good deal. He's like, look, your health is worth something, mental, physical health, you'll get it all, but you've got to let it go. You've got to forgive. You've got to forgive. And this is, I think, what's so hard for so many people because they think they're losing when they forgive. And that's just not the case. You win. Every time you forgive, you win. Now I know, look, I've been working on this for years. I'm still not an ace at this, Lord, I'm trying, right? you know this, I'm trying. I'm not an ace at it. But at the same time, I know where I've got to get. I know I've got to get that place. And those voices, they come inside and they say, oh, you're letting them off the hook. Oh, that's not justice. It's not fair. It's not right. Well, if you've got that problem, I've got a video for that, for dealing with those head bullies. But I encourage you, go ahead and forgive. Go ahead, forgive, and just trust me, you'll be better off for it. Take Wild Bill's story for it. You win when you forgive. Thanks so much for watching.